Okay. Hi, Barry. Very, very nice to meet you again after, I can, 4 years maybe that we first
About
met.
right. Yeah, yeah. Um, that was almost exactly 4 years ago for breakfast, I think.
I remember that I was very, very sick that day. But yeah, do you remember where that was? I do not remember.
It was in Calabasas. You guys had played the previous night, and then we met up. Well, we met for a little bit between sets and talked a little that evening. But then we had breakfast with Leonardo the next morning.
Yeah. Are you still working for Line 6?
I am.
Yeah, yeah.
I am. Although now it's part of the Yamaha Guitar Group. So,
Mhm.
and my job has changed completely since the last time we spoke. Um, but the
Mhm.
Yamaha Guitar Group is Line 6, Ampeg, and all of the guitar and bass products for Yamaha.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, like I first knew you as an artist, as a guitar player, as like a maker of fantastic experimental music, and and only then did I find out that you were writing for a Guitar Player magazine back then, right? And then later on, you started working for Line 6. So that's kind of like sort of that I know that little bit about you, Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was a guitar player for 12 years and with Mix, an electronic musician, a little before that, an editor at all those publications. And then I left guitar player kind of at the ideal time, before the complete collapse of the publishing industry. And
hmm hmm
then I was doing, a lot of freelance work and also writing cues for a Warner production library and just, kind of getting by in the gig economy there for a couple of years. And then I was offered the job as a product marketing manager for Line 6,
hmm
which I could not say no to. And I moved from San Francisco down to just north of LA to take
Yeah,
that job.
yeah,
And it was great. And I'm really happy with everything. I was really fortunate to have that opportunity.
yes. And I think that at some point when there were the fires, you got lucky, right? Your house did not burn down.
That's the lucky part. Yeah, I was evacuated for 3 weeks, and
Okay.
it was, yeah, pretty brutal. The fire literally stopped on the property line, like right across.
Wow.
There's a chain link fence
hmm
on the line, and on one side of it was grass, and
hmm
on the other side of it was complete devastation and ruin as far as the eye could see. So that was a pretty challenging time. I
hmm
was fortunate I had good insurance, and so my insurance company, put me up and fed me and cleaned all my things and replaced a lot of stuff. But there were many, many people, obviously, who didn't fare as well.
hmm
Uh,
hmm
Neighbor right above me's house is gone. Um, and then there was another huge fire that was happening in Northern California at the time where many, many people were killed.
hmm
I don't think anyone actually lost their life, or if it, maybe just one or two people in the fires here, as
hmm
expensive as they were. So, all told, I was extraordinarily fortunate around the fire. But yeah, it was a real. I found out about it around midnight. I had taken a break. I was getting ready to go to sleep, and I have a little toy hot tub out on the edge of the canyon that I go sit in sometimes, look at the stars before I go to bed, have a glass of water. And I knew there was a fire burning in Thousand Oaks, which is on the other side of the ridge. I live up in the mountains by Malibu Lake. So amazing. And I was watching the smoke, and I could see the red from the light from the fire coming over the edge. And then suddenly there were actual flames coming over the edge.
I see.
And that was a few miles away, but the Santa Ana winds were blowing fiercely. And so I loaded all my stuff into my car, packed every inch of it, and took off. And I was driving through, areas that were on fire, essentially. Never a danger, but it was just I'd keep driving thinking I was going to get out of it, and the fire was just everywhere. But the interesting thing about that was trying to decide of all my belongings what I would bring with me.
Mhm.
So, I pack my master tapes,
Mhm.
or recordings, my journals that I've been keeping since I was a kid, obviously some guitars and things, and hard drives, and my best wine. My priorities in order, so.
It's interesting that you list these things because I experience you as a person who's very much like interested in many different things and sort of also passionate about a variety of things. And like one um, so like your love for music technology and the history of music technology, for example, I find very interesting. Then your guitarist side, I don't think I've talked with you much about you being a guitarist much. And
Right.
like right now, like we will be on the new Stefan Thelen album together, right? And so we need to talk about that. But like my question is really, so um, what would you say is like your the the major passion in your life? Is that music? Is that writing? Or is that uh, music technology or wine? Or
Right. Um, at one time in my life, quite a long time ago, wine was probably my primary passion. I had a huge collection and I was really into it, studying it and visiting the wine country all the time.
Mhm.
Those days have passed because the wines that I love to drink now are exorbitantly expensive and only rich people can afford them. So I'm kind of out of that game by default. But uh, yeah, that's a good question. I think, the thing that brings the most enjoyment and excitement and inspiration to me is just working on music, no matter what it is. And particularly the improvisational aspects. The idea that 1 minute there's nothing, and then a half an hour later there's something, and sometimes it's really great. And it's just those moments where you play something back that just happened, and you just think, where in the world did that come from?
Yeah.
And how fortunate am I to be living a life where this happens, where you have access to this ecstasy in a way. So that's probably it. The gear stuff, not so much. I mean, I've had sort of the same things for a long time. Some things change out, but I play basically one guitar, and I've been playing the same guitar forever. And I do have a few other guitars, but I hardly ever use them.
Hmm.
I had a beautiful 1969 Les Paul Custom with 1959 PAFs and knobs on it that I'd had since I was a kid. I sold it because I never played that guitar, and I
Oh.
just felt guilty about keeping it under my bed and pulling it out and showing it off to people.
Mhm.
It's like somebody who's making good music should have that instrument, and so that's a kind of an
So
example of what
what's your
priorities.
what's your main instrument at the moment?
It's a 2004 PRS Custom 24 Brazilian. So
Hmm.
it's just a regular Custom 24, but it has a Brazilian rosewood fingerboard and some
Hmm.
fancy stuff on the headstock. And you
Hmm.
know, it's actually a little fancier than I would have necessarily liked. If you want to hear the story behind that, it's kind of fun. I had reviewed the guitar for Guitar Player, and the conclusion that I came up, or the conclusion I had was that it was maybe a perfect guitar. There was nothing, I could find nothing to report about it that I didn't love. It played beautifully, it played in tune perfectly, intonation, everything was just incredible, sounded fantastic. But it's a pretty expensive guitar. And at the time I was still playing the Les Paul, and I had another PRS, actually a less expensive one. And so but I kept the guitar under my bed. I never sent it back. And I guess in the back of my mind, I was hoping that no one would ask for it again and that I would just get to keep it, but I wasn't going to play it because I didn't want to mess it up and have to pay for it. But over the course of about a year, I kept pulling it out. And it got more frequent that I would pull it out and look at it and play it. And I was thinking, oh, I really like this guitar. And then one day, I went into the office with another guitar and somebody asked if it was the PRS. I said, no. They said, well, they called and they want the guitar back. In fact, they sold it and they want you to overnight the guitar back to
Oh,
them.
oh.
And I guess the look on my face was just, I was crushed. And the guy who was talking to me saw that. He was perceptive enough. And so we packed it up and I sent it back. And the guy at PRS, and I won't give his name because he might get in trouble, but the guy at PRS called me the next day and he said, thanks for sending this back, but it's got a horrible ding in the back of it. I can't sell it.
Oh.
And I said, no, it's in, he goes like, Barry, you're not understanding me. It has a horrible ding. Take it off my hands for half price. You'll be doing me a big favor. And that's how I got the guitar.
Oh, that's a wonderful story.
And it's just, it does everything I need it to do. So
Yeah, some things that like need to be together, they'll come together eventually, So that guitar really belonged to you then.
yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, it came that close to not belonging to me.
yeah. But yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so as you know, I'm kind of like associated with Moon June Records now, with Leonardo Pavkovich kind of became the well, booking agent first of all for Stickman, and so he discovered me, and like I think the first album that I like really listened to of yours was the Hologrammatron or Grammaton or
Yeah.
yeah, album, and that was released on Moon June Records. I recently found out. I wasn't aware of that anymore.
Yeah.
So how did you meet Leonardo?
Well, that's a good question. Probably through Alan Holdsworth.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I crossed paths with Alan quite a number of times and got to be kind of friends with him. And as you know, Leonardo was basically responsible for reinvigorating Alan's career. I think Alan did his greatest work in that time. So
Hmm.
it was a beautiful thing. And there were other things we crossed paths on, probably some stuff with Tony Levin and other, we just had, people that we were both, we both knew or were friends with. And uh, he had told me that he really liked the record. At that time, Moonjin was kind of just getting started. He had, this was 10, 11 years ago. He advised me to try to, he said he liked the record enough, he advised me to try to put it out on a bigger label. And so I did some shopping and things, and I just was not able to find a deal that I thought was right, a label that was right, or they were not interested in it or something. And then he said, well, let's put it out together. And I was really happy with that. He's an outstanding human being in every regard. And Moonjun's a great label, and he has people like you on it. So um, yeah, he's one of my favorite human beings in all the world. So
Oh,
I was really, really, really happy about that.
he's really a special person, and he has this gift to be like the big connector of like so many people, and really amazing good people, right, that he kind of like pulls together with his personality. It's just wonderful. Yeah. And yeah, so it's interesting that after all these years that my old friend Stefan Thelen, who started to record these fractal guitar albums, and asked me. Actually, I think I was probably the first guy he asked to contribute with him on that project a few years back for Fractal Guitar 1, which, that's going to be a Fractal Guitar 2. And so how did you and Stefan connect? So I don't know.
Good question. I don't, maybe through Bernard. I'm sure I reviewed a Sonar record. I loved Sonar, and we did some stories. I can't recall whether I did the Sonar story for Guitar Player or whether Anil Prasad did that one. He used to write a bunch of stuff for us
Yeah.
before I left there. And then, of course, when I left, he left too. I do recall Stefan came to my home in Redwood City about 5 years ago, something like that. And we hung out and had a great time talking. And yeah, I think things just, we stayed in touch one way or another over that time for various reasons. And then he was generous enough to ask me to contribute to the record,
Hmm.
which I was, thrilled to do. So, because so,
Yeah.
so many of my, favorite musicians are on those record, and then they went to, including you.
It's an incredible. I really enjoyed working on that project. Like it's I think for me it's sort of like the best of both worlds. Like it has the qualities of a band Sonar, which is cool, but then it also has more that painting with sound aspect to it as well, which both you and I kind of like like stand for a little bit, right? And
Right.
it's yeah, and I mean here we're basically like you said that maybe your favorite thing is to about music is that you have like this with improvisation or even writing doesn't matter like any sort of like getting sound out right is extremely satisfying because you go from having nothing to having something right like in an instant and it's just if it's kind of like I really don't normally use that expression, but it is an expression, right, of some kind to make noise, and I think it's probably something very very primal, like with your voice or grunting or something like that, and we just do that with guitars and with electronics, with pedals and making a noise and looping technology and especially with looping technology that it's very immediate. You have the immediate feedback from what you've recorded. It's being played back to you and inspires you to create more, right?
Absolutely.
So you have experience, and at least like I don't know so much about Joe Meek, but I know that you wrote a book, and we've talked about that briefly when we met. So there is a long history of musical inventions, and I think there was like Joe Meek, and I mean the only other guy I know a little bit about is Les Paul.
Yeah,
With his multi-tracking and the kind of looping that he did, right? So it's a very rather old concept, and I guess you know much more about the development of these ideas, let's say over the years, and it would be wonderful if you could tell us a little bit about what you know and what you've experienced in your lifetime about the like the yeah the how did these ideas develop over time.
you mean historically with other people or with me personally?
Well, with you personally, first of all. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first let me mention. It's funny you would bring up Les Paul. One of the things that I do with my job with Yamaha Guitar Group is I've launched a blog called Model Citizens, and it's not a typical corporate blog. I'm really trying to go make it be more like a online publication of interest to anybody who's involved in music or recording. And the most recent post I just put up yesterday is about Les Paul and his sound
Oh.
on recording. So if anybody wants to go to blog.line6, you can find this story.
Mhm.
Briefly, what it's about is, Les Paul, it's so funny. When he passed away in 2009, we did a whole issue of Guitar Player, devoted to him. And then there were all these obits and things that were happening everywhere. And the two things that everybody says over and over is he invented the solid body electric guitar and he invented multi-track recording, neither of which is even remotely true. But the things that he did do are so much more, extraordinary than either of those things. And so I think there's just some confusion around semantics and things. People think
Mhm.
multi-track, they think, oh, discrete tracks on a recorder. And then Les Paul was involved in some way with the development of an actual 8-track tape recorder, one of only two that were in existence. But he never used that on it. None of the hit records that he made, either by himself or with Mary Ford, not a single one of them was done on that. And in fact, a lot of them weren't even done on tape.
Hmm.
So the what this article is about is amazing stuff. Like, so in 1947, 40, late 47, he finished up what he called his new sound recordings, where he's using two disc cutting machines, like
Hmm.
acetate discs, large discs, and he's bouncing back and forth between them, doing sound and sound. And it's unbelievable. And the things that he's doing, he's got like stuff that's, you know, sped up an octave higher or lower. So he's recording, he's got no metronome or anything. So he bangs out the time on the guitar, and he knows that once he's layered like 20 tracks, certain things are going to fall into the background and you're going to lose high frequencies. And he plans all this out ahead of time. So
Hmm.
he bangs out the time, and that's his drum. And then, you know, he'll slow the lathes down half speed. So he's playing along, playing melodies, and his phrasing and everything is, you know, it's an octave down. So you're playing along to and playing it in a way that then when he puts it back to normal speed, it's perfect. You know, the phrasing, everything is perfect. That is that's not normal human activity. You know, this guy is supernatural in that regard. And then he eventually starts doing it like a Bing Crosby, and gave him a Ampex 300, one of the earliest. You know, it's a mono tape recorder. And then one of the very first things he does is stick another head on it so that he can have it loop back in and do sound on sound recording on one machine.
Hmm.
You know, anyway, so it's stuff like that that's really makes him so great.
Hmm.
Uh, and he was, this is a weird thing. So he was the Joe Meek's hero. And I don't know if people watching know who Joe Meek is. It's worth checking him out. At least Google him and or go up to YouTube and try to find some things to listen to, or you can buy my book. But he was fascinated by Les Paul, but Les was super secretive, and he never let anyone, even his wife, know what he was doing. He had his garage studio, and it was just absolutely top secret. So Meek had to figure this stuff out by listening, you know, and kind of reverse engineer it from the recordings. And he was doing really similar things. But where it gets really, and Meek was also pioneering a lot of stuff like Les did. So, like he made a spring reverb out of a broken fan in the 50s, you know, way before the
Yeah.
spring reverbs were, you know, developed by Premier or the other folks. And then he was tape flanging in 57.
Hmm.
People think that started in 1967 with Ichiku Park. Instead, you know, not even close. He was the first guy to put to close mic things in England, to use compression and limiting in a creative way instead of a corrective way. He basically broke all the rules. But he also wrote songs, like really sappy kind of, you know, he wanted to write hits, like pop hits. And in the 50s, early 60s, that's what the hits were. Les Paul and Mary Ford recorded a song called Put a Ring on My Finger that he had written under the pseudonym. They did all this stuff under pseudonyms so they could avoid taxes and weird, you know, copyright thing. And then the money that was generated from that record is what Meek used in order to found his label. And Les didn't know that. When I talked to Les about it, he'd never even heard of Joe Meek. He thought Joe Meek was the gear, you know, that came out. That one of the guys that worked with Joe, you know, started this line of gear. And when I told him all about the parallels about what he was doing and what Joe was doing, he said, "It just goes to show how somebody can be so close and yet so far away." You know, and it's really interesting the way their two lives parallel, because in most respects they're completely the opposite of each other. Les was a musical genius, wonderful guitar player, innovative guitar player. Joe Meek was tone deaf, you know, couldn't sing to save his life, couldn't play anything. There's great recordings of him, like he'd do demos and give them to his band, his house band to do, where he's just caterwauling. You know, it's horrible. It's not even listenable. But the band, which included Richie Blackmore for many of the recordings, would listen to that noise and turn it into something.
Hmm.
Anyway, both fascinating characters. Les Paul, the way it connects to me is when I was a little kid, meaning like 4 years old, my parents had an old Les Paul and Mary Ford record, and it had a picture of Les on the front with his beautiful Les Paul guitar, just sweet looking guitar. And I fixated on that. And I loved the sounds like Tiger Rag and a bunch of the other tracks on there that really appealed to me. And I think listening to those sounds, all the like bizarre sounds that he got, did something to my little impressionable brain, and just I just never got over that, and I'm kind of still there. It's the same thing. So I guess that's where they cross in, and then this is going to sound really strange, but I also, when I was a tiny little kid, maybe even younger than 4, I had a record called, was a Walt Disney record. It was about Ludwig von Drake. Ludwig von Drake's a duck. And there's a part of it where he goes in the recording studio. And he's talking all about recording. And he's talking about the echo chamber. And he goes in the echo chamber. And there's this gag about how the echo chamber is filling up with water and all this stuff. I'm pretty sure that had some sort of
Wow.
perverse in the brain of the little kid too. Like, what's an echo chamber?
Yes. Yeah.
So as soon as I started playing guitar, I mean, the very first gig that I ever played that I can remember is I was in junior high school, and they were having a happening, a psychedelic happening, which that kind of stuff actually took place back then.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an Ampeg Gemini 2 amplifier, which had reverb and vibrato. And I think at that time I had a Greco semi-hollow sort of ES335 style, but phony guitar, but it had a Bigsby on it. And I think all I did is, they had a black light because it was the psychedelic happening. I put a sheet over a chair, put my amp on top of the sheet in the chair so that it would glow white all around it, turn the reverb all the way up, and probably the tremolo or whatever it was too. And I'm wanging on the bar, and just making weird noise for about 10 minutes. That's pretty much been the template of my entire career right
there. How old were you when that was?
Like 9th grade. So
okay.
Young. Yeah, I had just got the instruments, and that's about all I could do.
That's a beautiful beginning, though. Like for me, it was sort of like the opposite, with like classical training, and like the sound aspect of music came into my life much later. Yeah, in my mid-20s, early 20s, mid-20s. Yeah.
So you were playing classical guitar?
Yeah, well, I had my first classical guitar lesson on the 3rd of September 1987. I remember that. And it felt late, I have to say. Like, because I was already into music for, say, maybe almost all my life, but like I became sort of conscious of music when I was around 10, when I realized it's something that speaks to me. And then like those 5 years before I actually had a proper guitar lesson, like looking back, feels like a very long time. And I'm still wondering, what did I do? Right? I guess I listened to music a lot. Yeah. So, but then once I had the guitar lessons, everything kind of like fell into place. I at that point I never had to practice, because I was sort of like talented enough, let's say, to understand how the notation works, and then how to play. And at that point I didn't understand that there is something like that practice would actually help. As I was too young. But like I did not have that approach, this immediate approach of making that noise. That was something that was sort of came much later, like what you just described. Like you have like the guitar as like something very very what's the word, the opposite of well, just something that comes from the inside, like just like the primal thing we were talking about, right? For me, it was something cultured, the way that it was taught to me, right?
Right, right, sure. So were you listening to primarily classical music, or what kind of music were you surrounded by when you were developing?
It was what is nowadays called classic rock was probably what I heard the most on the radio in the 70s. And my mother was a fan of like the Eagles, and we had a couple of Beatles albums. And so like then later on, like maybe late 70s, early 80s, like some Fleetwood Mac. Um, and yeah, then I my my uncle and my mother took me to a Mike Oldfield concert in '82 when I was close to 10 years old, and that changed my life. That was really like, for me, that was the template, of like an artist who is composer, producer, guitarist, like doing everything himself, sort of. That was the kind of the blueprint for what interested me in music. And also like somebody who was not really stylistically fixed, not
Right,
like doing all sorts of things. And that's sort of like that's sort of how I feel about my music and my career, that I'm basically interested in music as a concept and not as a genre or a style or not even uh, a certain area of the arts. I think it just encompasses everything for me.
right, right. Have you always been as prolific as you are?
No, it's just something that just came with time. I mean, I have to admit that yes, probably because when I was at this about the same time, like when I was 9 years old, my father had a really bad accident and almost died,
Mm,
and so everything in our family changed. Like I basically, in a way, kind of lost my parents overnight because they didn't have time for me anymore, right?
right,
And I remember that was the moment when I sort of like started becoming really interested in music, and it sort of it became sort of a guide to me, like a parent to me in music, I would say. Even though I also had my grandmother who was a great person, but somehow music took that role. And so from that point on, I already had this, I wasn't really prolific, but I already had a vision, let's say. And
mm,
that's why I said earlier that these 5 years between, the accident my father had and actually then starting to learn a guitar instrument properly, um, feels like a long time now looking back. And I really have to say it's insane. It's kind of, well, insane, crazy that I don't remember anything about those years.
yeah, although I don't think that's unusual. Um,
How was that for you? Like your youth? Do you remember?
um, I do remember some things. I was really lucky. My brother is 10 years older than I am. And so when I was really young, he was constantly listening to music. He had a big collection. He listened to the radio nonstop. And so I was inundated with music that was really like of all types, mostly what passed for pop back then, but it could be anything. It could be psychedelic music, it could be anything. Didn't matter. It was all on the radio, really. They didn't differentiate like they do now. And so I guess when I was really tiny, like just born, basically, I was surrounded by British invasion and 60s music. And um, then I think where I got really the most interested was listening to the Beatles, because the Beatles dominated reality, for the time that they were together. It was like everybody looked to them. I mean, collectively the culture did. I was a little too young to be looking to anybody for much of anything, but um, that music, particularly when you got off to like Magical Mystery Tour and or even earlier, Revolver, or it started to get into more like sound design and bringing in other elements besides just banging away on some guitars and bass and drums. That I think had a huge influence on me. And then one of the very first, I think the very first concert I ever saw was Iron Butterfly.
Mhm.
And Iron Butterfly, for all of the, you can make fun of them all you like, and it's all totally justified. But the guitar player, Eric Braun, I think he was 17 years old or something back when they were, at their height, he used fuzz and reverb and wah pedals, anything that was available. And he was a classically trained guitar player, and so there's a lot of that, these motifs that it worked into his style. And I loved his tone and the sound. So the music's mostly unlistenable now because the singing is so unbearable, but and the lyrics are kind of stupid. But the guitar playing is just, I think, wonderful, and that had a major impact on me watching somebody do that live. And I saw Led Zeppelin, and they were by that time, doing similar things, where they're really processing things a lot. And that side of the music always really appealed to me. And then I think the thing that probably changed my life the most in terms of music was I saw King Crimson in 1974, 73 or so, 73 maybe. It was right after Jamie Muir had left the Larks Touch band. And I was a very, young, impressionable lad. And that concert, it's impossible to describe it. I mean, unless you were there, the music was, of course, extraordinary, but it was this tangible force that was in the hall. It was like I felt like the ether was going to open up, and like another dimension was going to emerge. I mean, it changed my life. And it wasn't just me, because I went with my friend Brett and his brother Jay, and Jay at that time was close to death with muscular dystrophy. He was in a wheelchair, and we brought him to the show. And at the end of the concert, Jay said, "If I die tomorrow, my life will have been worthwhile now, having seen this." That's the level of impact that it had on
Wow.
us. And my life was never the same after that. And I saw,
Hey, let me ask you something about that. So you were talking about this energy, right? Was that energy there even before the band played, or was there the expectation? Was there some sort of expectation that already set the mood? Do you remember that?
It's a good question. No, I'm pretty sure. I mean, we had already heard the record, Lark's Tongues, I remember I had loved the previous King Crimson records, and every one of them was so different. It just, it was such a huge part of my early life. But the Lark's Tongue record kind of freaked us out. It starts really super quiet, and you turn the volume way up, like, what's going on with this record? And then all of a sudden it just blows the walls down. So we were still trying to assimilate that, like, what exactly is this? And it was so radically different than anything else that had been done under that name. But I remember from the very beginning of it, they opened with Dr. Diamond, which I'd never heard the song before. And it was, they kept changing that up. If you go back and listen to all those archival recordings, there's like 10 different versions of it.
Yeah.
But this one was just, I don't know. I do remember that. So the very beginning, the lights come up and they start with that riff. But mostly what I remember are the improvisations and the energy. I mean, there was a kind of medieval magical quality around the image of that group too, like wearing the occult symbols and all of the things that were involved with. And so I think we were kind of sucked into that a little bit. And so to that extent, we came in with expectations. And so in my imagination, I'm thinking, like, what sort of energy would be associated with that? That may have colored it. But the primary thing was just, like I said, it was tangible. It was like you could touch it almost. And I can't, words fail, and I make a living with words, and I can't even begin to tell you what this was like. But it was transformational on every level. It wasn't just like, oh, this is cool music, I'm inspired. It was like it rearranged the molecules in my soul. It was
yes.
So yeah, that was a pivotal experience. And I saw the group again like a year later, and there was not that same thing. They were great, they were really great. And if I hadn't had that earlier experience, I would have just raved similarly about that show. But there was something special about this one. And then I've seen different incarnations of the band over the years, and they're all great. I saw the Discipline group shortly after they changed their name, to King Crimson. They played in a little club in San Francisco. I was like, 5 feet away. There was no stage. They're set up on the floor,
Mhm.
you know. In that show, I remember I went with the woman I was living with, Kathy, then, and we just kept looking at each other like, did that just happen? Like these guys are fantastic, but it was a different kind of fantastic. It was um, just as powerful and amazing, but it didn't have that otherworldly quality that the one show had. I guess that's the best. I mean, it's a cliche word and doesn't mean anything probably, but
Yeah.
that's the best descriptor. There was something that was not normal about that. It was like alien to anything I'd ever experienced. And it was almost apart from the music, but the music was the source. So like they'd be improvising on something and then suddenly it would take off in some other direction. Like they just, move like a flock of birds, and you'd feel that it would pick up. So it was being radiated from the stage for sure. And then amplified by the audience, because as the audience begins to feel that, everybody feels that. It's not something that's a special elite group or anything. It's no matter who the audience are, when that magic thing is happening, it's universal. Everybody knows it's there. And this was a special case of that, where it was a select audience. I mean, the kind of audience that would come to this show in St. Petersburg, Florida, and that had the expectation or the capacity to resonate with that sort of thing. So it was a reciprocal amplification thing, I'm sure. But it did seem, as I recall, as best I can, this is a long time ago, it did seem to move and change with the music, and the band's feeling it too. They start to move. It's not like they're up there casting spells, they're in the flow of it, and it would start to take off, and they were just as surprised as anybody, just like, wow, what was that? So anyway, that's my.
Yeah, it really can be a communal experience, right? Like when, as you say, like the band creates the energy goes to the audience and comes back, and you almost get this kind of like feedback loop. And as we know, working with feedback, it can easily get out of control, and things can appear or emerge that are totally fascinating, and that you cannot there's no way you can replicate the same factors in a different time, different place with different people. And so does a recording exist of that show?
um it's funny you'd ask that. There's a recording that claims to be that, but what it actually is, and it's funny, it's the rehearsals. And this was recorded by my friend Steve, who was an usher. He was working at the Bayfront Center where this took place. He had his little cassette recorder out there, and he was recording stuff. And there's a part at the end where somebody comes up and tells him he has to turn it off. Like they force him to turn it off, and he's arguing with them for a while, long enough to get as much of it as he can. But they're working out the riff of what became The Great Deceiver.
Mm-hmm.
So that tune's already being, it's underway. They're developing it during the rehearsals.
Mm-hmm.
It's really fascinating because you can hear how they're trying out different ideas and things, and it's pretty far removed from where it winds up. But that masquerades under the title of "This Is the Show" with that date on it. So if you search, through the bootleg
Okay.
web, if you find that, it's not going to be it.
Yeah. So
I do have a recording of the show the following year in Curtis Hickson Hall in Tampa.
mm-hmm.
It's great. But I think they were, part of the reason that one was kind of weird is because originally they were the headliners and tickets weren't selling well. So they brought Poco in, and Poco became the headliner. And Poco had a giant banner, by which I mean like hundreds of feet by hundreds of feet of a giant horseshoe in Poco. I think it was green.
Mm-hmm.
And that was behind the band, so
Okay.
they were kind of annoying.
That's awkward.
Very.
So as you know, I think you know that David Cross joined Stickman for some one-off shows, but also for a tour in South America a couple of years ago. And I have to say, David's presence, I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't expect it, but he really has the Crimson vibe. He has the vibe of that band. Like where really, like if you're listening to the recordings and you're kind of like the big stars of Fripp and Wetton and Bruford, right, in a way, and Cross is like a little bit, but like the way that he plays the mellotron chords, like the voicings he uses, and just his skill of improvising really brought so much to the band, so that it was a real, I have to say, a real honor to play with him. And also when we did that longish tour in South America, all the improvs, like I kind of like, in a way, I wanted them to be a little bit like the
Yeah,
70s Crimson.
yeah. Of course. Solo records are really good too. He's just a remarkable musician.
Yes. Yeah. I remember I had one of his solo records pretty early on, Testing for Destruction or something it's called.
Mm, mm.
That was yeah, fascinating, isn't it? Like this experience of the power of music. I think it's I mean, it doesn't speak to everybody, right? Like we should not forget that, but for a certain person, the music can mean everything. And I mean, this has only recently come to my attention, but there's some sort of responsibility, even in a way, a little bit of a responsibility for musicians to be some sort of, because you're a lot is being projected onto you when you're on stage creating that music, right? So I there's one thing. So it's not so much about how you play, really. I think it's really more about what you play, like the material. It's very true for Crimson, right? If you think about it, it's that kind of music. No other band has ever played with that kind of sound and that kind of musical building blocks, and the impact that this, as if you've just described, the impact that can have on young people is really, really, really immense. And so it's because they're just thinking back at the first concert that I saw, the Mike Oldfield concert, of which there is a recording that I have. There's a bootleg recording of that very show. It's also on YouTube, actually. And so just these musicians and the way they play also sort of become some sort of like a blueprint for what one likes, right? And that, I find that really fascinating, because I believe that it's not about, I mean, in this case, the band that was a great band with really great musicians, but I don't think it matters. It could have been sort of like, I don't want to say any band, but the power of music kind of um, transcends ability. Let's say it's not about that. Like I really believe that the power of music is very much beyond the skill. It has nothing to do really with skill. It
Yeah,
can have something to do with skill, but it doesn't have to, right?
right. Oh, good point. I mean, think
It-
of
I was
uh,
thinking about you making the noises with for your very first show, right?
or everything else I do, because I don't consider myself to be a virtuoso musician by any stretch
Right.
of the imagination. So I try to scrape by on sound, and
Yeah.
I practice enough to be able to play some parts that I like, and that's about what I do. But
Yeah, but that's you can become an expert at that. It just, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not necessarily about how fast you can move your fingers, or that you're actually you don't even need to be aware of what you're doing. It's just that you are open to kind of like express some sort of, and I kind of like break it down to the movement. Like in the end, it's some sort of movement you make that creates the sound, and
hmm,
and 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 really just to have the courage even to just make that movement and to just allow it to be amplified, right? That's really in a way what is necessary, right? To go from nothing to something, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, a lot of it is, after a lot of what I do is post production. I mean, it's not the actual performance of it.
Mhm.
So the performance of it is, once I have that down, I get to something that I'm happy with. That's the beginning of it, and then I usually wind up doing a lot of manipulation of different types, which I've done my whole life. I mean, there's a this is a weird story. So I made this. How do we even tell this? So a Canadian record label, the Morning Trip, just released an LP version of the very first recording that I ever made, and I made it on a 4-track cassette deck in my bedroom when I was a kid. And it was released in 1986 on cassette by a Canadian label. I don't know what it is with the Canadian thing here, but when my record Mythos came out on Very Fast label in 86, I was contacted by a bunch of people like, do you have anything else? And this guy from Canada really was pressing me hard to come up with something. And I didn't have an album. That was the first serious record I ever made, done in a real studio. And he was so persistent. And so I looked to find a bunch of recordings that were just sort of random things I'd been doing, since I was really young. And I put together a collection of things and said, what do you think of this? And he goes, oh, I love this. We're going to put this out as a record. That cassette, I don't know how many of those things he made, but it's bizarre. It's like people would contact me every few years and say, can we release this on a record? Not like digital or CD. And I'd say, look, I don't even know where those recordings are. I have no idea. This is it's not really an album. I never intended that to be an album. I don't even know how they know about it. It must be because of these cassettes. And then strangely, when I did the deal with these guys, I went back and looked through some old boxes of things, and I found a whole box of these cassettes. I guess it had like 30 of them in it, and I didn't try playing them. They were all shrink wrapped. I put one up on eBay, and in less than 24 hours, it sold for $45.
Oh.
And I'm thinking, okay, these guys are not as silly as I thought. There's something out there they're going to make some money on this. Sadly, none of the cassettes played anymore. They were damaged, and so I had to give the guys $45 back. But it made the point that there's some value. Then, strangely, one of the labels, this was about 6 years ago, a label that was kind of a legitimate label, also wanted to do this. And so I went back and I found every little bit of, the best quality versions of all of these tracks. And I wrote up like liner notes and did some sorts of things. And we were all ready to go. And then I'd even signed the contract with this guy, but I just got a really strong readout on my douchebag meter. It was like, sorry to introduce that term into your podcast. But this guy was not happening. And I just said, you can sue me, if you want. I'm breaking the contract. You can't put my thing out. So I shelved it, but I had everything ready to go. Then a couple of years later, I took all of my analog recordings, mostly a bunch of 2-inch, 16 and 24 track stuff, but also 1/4-inch half track, and 1/2-inch reels. I took them into Fantasy Studios in Berkeley, and they baked the tapes and transferred them all over to Pro Tools at high res.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, on a bunch of the reels, they weren't accurately indexed. And I found about half of these recordings, the original half track, analog masters. So suddenly I had a pretty good collection of stuff. And then when these guys came and asked if they could put it out, I said, yeah, you got to give this to a serious mastering engineer. So it went to this guy, Noah something in Toronto, great sound restoration and mastering guy. And he turned these recordings into something that actually sounds fantastic.
Wow.
Stunning. But anyway, circling back to where this started, the manipulating things. I mean, what I did with it is on this little 4-track cassette thing, it had a speed control.
Mhm.
So you could turn it down, I think, at least an octave down, octave up, or anything in between. And then it recorded 4 tracks onto a cassette in one direction. So you could turn the cassette over and it would play in reverse.
Yeah.
And so I used those things, and I was bowing the guitar, doing a lot of stuff. I had an Echoplex and a God knows what else. And um, uh, I pushed that thing to its maximum. So a lot of these recordings, they incorporate, it's the same sort of thing that we do now with a looper, where you're, dropping things an octave or pushing them up or changing the speed. But it was all done manually back then and by flipping stuff around. But there's things on that recording that are very much, I'm still really happy with, even though I made them when I was a kid. It's because you're just taking what you have, and you hear something in your head and you figure out, how can I do that with what I've got? And even if it's really primitive like this, or the other way around, you have the technology and you just think, okay, what can I, how can I use this to at this end that I have to make something that's interesting? And you just keep fooling around with it until you get something. But I go back and listen to those things and I think, it's kind of like the junior high school performance. I listen to these really crude early things, relatively speaking, crude. And I just think that's the same thing I do now.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
using all kinds of amazing plugins and just, incredible stuff now, but nothing's changed.
Yeah.
And I still get the same thrill now doing this that I did then. I'm seeking that. That's what the payoff is, particularly now that you can't, I mean, you make money playing music because you tour and do things, but I don't make any money doing music. It's just not, that's not a motivator for me.
Yeah.
I make money on the little cues, they use on the TV shows and stuff, but, I don't make records with the idea that, this is going to be some sort of there's a financial reward to it. It's just labor of love. And the things that motivate that haven't changed
Yeah.
my whole.
Exactly. Yeah. You're raising a really, really important point. I don't know if everybody's like that, but at least for me, I used to think I'm not good enough, or I used to think it's like what I did was maybe not sounding good enough, or it's a good motivator, to believe you kind of like need to work and practice or whatever. But I have to say, I completely agree with you. If I listen to like just even like my very first recordings, it's me, and I was already a complete artist back then, and I was a good player, and everything was already in place. Not saying that I have been standing still, definitely not, but the artistic expression, let's say, like my heart or my soul, even, like maybe that's a better word, that was always present, and that was always there, and it is always. There's this one little story which I sometimes remember, and I just remembered it, is that I had to drive with a bicycle about 20 miles to get to a proper music store where they had bass amps and guitar amps and guitars and basses and even a section with drums. And I remember that the very first time I actually plugged the bass guitar into an amp, I played one note in the room. And I remember people in the room turning around, looking at me or looking at the sound that was coming from the instrument. Okay. So that's nothing special, right? Like in a way. But about maybe 15 years later, I befriended one of the guys who used to work in that store when I was there and I played that note. And he said to me 15 years later, Marcus, when I heard you play that note, I knew you were a real musician.
Mhm.
There was something about it, he said. It was just that one note, but there was something about it. And it gave me goosebumps then, it gives me goosebumps now, thinking about that, maybe there's something about and this is kind of like what maybe people call talent, or like that's the gift that maybe some people have, just to find, that I was allowed to find the medium or the material I was destined to work with somehow. I don't know if that's true, but it's sort of like this little story that I find fascinating.
Yeah, interesting. The the thing that occurred to me when you were talking about it is that there's meaning in that note.
Mhm.
And people can play, there's a lot of virtuoso players. You think particularly of many classical musicians, extraordinarily talented, but and this is, I don't mean to sound judgmental towards classical musicians. I have the greatest respect for classical musicians. But having tried to improvise or play with a few, um, with one really notable exception, I have had conversations with people that just say, look, I can play any score. I can do anything. I'm great. I can't write something, or I can't even just casually play something and improvise that I haven't ever played before, something that's my own. And there's a real concern about it. I mean, they're sincerely concerned about it. And the almost inescapable conclusion is that if you're too well trained in any particular thing, that can not only be a wonderful thing that allows you to do all kinds of remarkable things, but it can be an impediment. It can keep you from that. And so maybe I said, well, maybe the way, what it says, can you just play one note, with real, that's you? Can you play one note that's you? It doesn't have to be anything else, And I think that's a similar thing to what you're talking about. It's like, there's you're obviously a virtuoso musician, but what makes to me, this is just my view, what makes, your work in particular, different than what I was just describing is that uh, there's meaning to it. That there's something, it matters that you played that note. And I can't say why that is, it's
Yeah.
an intangible thing, but it is something that people can, like the guy that you talked to 15 years later, they recognize it, and you think of artists like Peter Hamill. I don't know if you're a Peter Hamill fan. Peter doesn't make any claims to be a great pianist or guitar player. In fact, when I interviewed him for Guitar Player magazine, he was a little embarrassed. Like, why would you want to talk to me? But if you've ever seen him perform live, that's like the last time I saw the Reformed Van de Graaff Generator play in Montreal at the Jazz Festival a while back, and I thought the roof was going to come off of the the theater. It was like, and these guys are not exactly spring chickens. They were just, the energy was overwhelming, and the audience was just freaking out. There was a girl sitting next to me who I was fortunate to kind of hang out with a little bit afterwards. She, I guess, was in her 30s, and she knew every word to every one of his songs. The music had impacted her that strongly, generations later. So he's a perfect example of that. It's just like, it's totally transformative. And those guys are great players. I don't, but that's not the whole story. It's not that they are good musicians. There's something else going on there. And the music, some of the most powerful stuff is some of the least sophisticated things that they're
Yes.
doing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And like when you were talking about the classical players, the classical music performers, I think there's also like probably those who never want to be an artist, let's say. So where maybe there was never the motivation to be inventive, let's say, right? And like I know one female piano player, and she's amazing, but she said to me, like, she wants to serve the composer. That's what she does. She doesn't even want to have her own she doesn't even want to influence the music in some kind. She does,
Interesting.
obviously, but she doesn't want to. And I found that interesting. And I think that there are just probably, and this is kind of like the sad case, is when there are actually people who become great classically trained players who actually originally come from the same place that I come from, where it's like the love for music, right? And somehow the training sort of kills that original motivation in you. I find that sad. And that was like one of the, I could say, few or many things that Robert Fripp taught me, like where he said, like, you don't go to conservatory. Like you said, like if you are a professional musician, you're going to do it anyway. So you can learn something else and be, and he was absolutely right. I don't know what would have happened to me if I had professionalized my outlook on music, let's say, as early as when I was 19 or something. And yeah. So for you, and I also spoke with Michael Peters. Are you aware of Michael Peters? This German loop guitarist. That,
Played at some of the looping festivals, I
yeah,
think in Santa Cruz. Yeah,
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 he did.
I have. Mhm.
So he's great, and I asked him a similar question because he was sort of also around for most of the development from the analog years to the digital years, or years or whatever. We don't know how long it's gonna be like that. And just in terms of like the music, the development of music technology, let's say, how do you see the development? Was there something like, was the invention of digital like a deep cut? Would you say it's a deep cut, or was there? How did we go from the Frippatronics with two tape loops, with two tape machines, to the Fripp in a box, and then to the Paradis loop delay, and so on. I'm sure you remember those times and can tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I remember the Paradise because I had a prototype that I used to record a bunch of stuff that's on my Memory and Imagination album. Yeah, that was incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
what a quantum leap. I don't know. I mean, I played around with two tape recorders for a while, and very briefly tried that, and
Mhm.
actually did some performing with it. I was using I was playing electric guitar, but I was also playing a 12-string acoustic guitar, amplified, doing some
Mhm.
stuff. It was an improvisational group with a guy named Michael Maisley. We called ourselves Thin Ice,
Mhm.
and we were entirely improvisational, like no idea what we were going to do.
Great name.
And and actually, one of the records we made is going to come out on this Canadian label next year, I think. And then Michael's record is coming out this year. That's a whole other story. But I do recall when the Boss digital delay pedal came out, and thinking, okay, this could be something. We could maybe use this in a different, not have to haul all that junk around. And but the delay time was so short on it. And then eventually there was a little Digitech, which went out to 2 seconds. And that was like revelatory, except that it was kind of crap sound, when you ran it out. So the transition, as I recall, as it impacted me, um, was a little bumpy in the beginning. Then I was able to get a PCM 42, a Lexicon PCM 42, and that changed my life completely. It's just like, oh my God, this thing's incredible. Um, so
Did you get like one with the looping mod? There was one that was modded, right? To have I think, like, I can't remember who it was, but David Torn was probably one of the first
mhm,
who had that.
right, yeah, he had his modded. I think the one I had was just stock. It went out, if you ran it at half, I think it was either 2 or 4 seconds. and then you could drop it to half, and it
Hmm.
would go out twice that far at greatly reduced bandwidth. The whole thing was only like 8K bandwidth anyway. The old Lexicon stuff, and I've had a like a Primetime 2 and some of the other things, and work with some of that ancient, gear in the studio back then. The specs, when you look at them, were not very good.
Hmm.
Well, it sounds incredible.
Yeah.
It probably had something to do with the, I don't know, with the converters or something. They just really knew what they were doing.
Hmm.
Uh, but the 42, when you ran it out to double time, it was pretty, even for a guitar, which is a narrow bandwidth instrument anyway, it really didn't, it wasn't great. So I used it at the normal speed most of the time.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's so funny, the whole analog digital thing. It's there's, I think, more neuroses around this thing, or at least there used to be. Now it's all merged together and nobody can really, it doesn't really matter anymore. But except you do have these strange things like people talking about, we're going to have, I think it's a, cassette culture, and what's next, 8 tracks, we're going to do 8-track releases. um but the LPs, you know I think the weirdest thing about that is people are putting out, like, a lot of, dance music, electronic music is obviously released on LP, and people are going, oh, that analog warmth, and it's like, you do realize, of course, that the only thing analog about this is the vinyl.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what I still find fascinating, that the time between mid 70s and mid 80s, you can almost, like, by the sound of a record, you can
Hmm,
sort of tell which year it was.
hmm,
Because you can say, okay, like let's say in 82, you had maybe the Fairlight on it, but
hmm,
you did not have a digital reverb on it. But then
hmm,
in 83, you had the digital reverb already, and
hmm.
but the say the Fairlight was already out of fashion, and not true, but like just saying, you could, like, just by observing which sounds have been used, which
Oh,
drum machine had just come out,
oh.
you could date the recording simply by the sounds used, and that sort of has changed, right? Because, like, they're like the tools. Well, I'm not so deeply into popular music, so maybe what I'm saying is bullshit, okay? But but that was the time where music technology was changing at such a pace where you could really you could date the albums.
Well, not only that, I mean, when the DX7 came out,
Oh
people
yeah.
used it for everything, and they didn't bother, for the most part, to even make their own presets. So you go, oh yeah, there's preset 32. That's preset 72. Yeah. I hear
Yes.
that Schiffer flute thing one more time, I'm gonna hurl chunks. It was just, yeah. But like you say, the reverbs, and the delays, the AMS changes everything. There's just certain sounds that, are a harmonizer, you know,
Yes.
the eventide harmonizers. You can tell when they do the jump from one model to the next one. If
Yes.
you're listening for that kind of stuff. Um,
It used to really put me off when I listened to a soundtrack. Like, I remember, well, what was it, like Solaris, or uh, I can't remember who the composer was, Clive Martinez maybe. Uh, and he is always using this 3 against 2 preset from the Eventide, which, like, in every single soundtrack he does, like from, I don't know, like maybe the film Traffic or like one of those films, and you always hear the same kind of delay. And it used to put me off hearing these and knowing, okay, yeah, that is a guitar through that preset.
right, right. Fortunately, the public probably doesn't make that distinction so much,
No,
but
no.
absolutely. I mean, it's pretty easy. I think in that period, it's the easiest to do the forensic kind of work, where you can nail it right down, probably to the month of the year based on what you're hearing, in terms of effects and synth patches and things. But yeah,
So
these,
sorry.
these days, I think it's all just blurred. It's all gone. I mean, like the emulations. Not that I'm an expert on synthesizers, or I owned a room full of expensive analog synthesizers or anything, but I do talk to people who do that. And the plugins, like the Arturia plugins of all the classic synths, the people who own the hardware tell me that they can hear a difference, but it's so minuscule. You know, it's not even it's irrelevant almost. It's
Mm.
statistically insignificant. That stuff just, the idea that, especially if you buy them on sale once a year, you can get the whole collection and you have essentially a room full of the greatest synthesizers
Yeah.
ever made, and they cost you a few $100. I mean, I think the biggest problem you have now, and this is, you know, talked about endlessly, is option overload. You know,
Yeah.
there's just too many things. And I mean, I have a lot of stuff. Fortunately, when I was working a guitar player, I was given things all the time.
Hmm.
That's just part of the job.
Hmm.
And I have so many plugins and virtual instruments and things. Many of them I have never even heard. I haven't
Hmm.
even listened to them yet.
Mm.
You know, they're there, but occasionally I'll pull one up. I'll be looking through a menu and I'll go like, I wonder what that is. You know, and pull it up. And think, oh my God, I've had this thing for 8 years and never used it. It sounds
You know,
really
it's
good.
it's it's the option overload, as you say, but I guess it's also because the haptic aspect of having the hardware in your hand, or the, like, obviously you can have a controller, but then the controller that you have is the same for the Mini Moog and the Prophet 5, right? And yeah, no, that just doesn't cut it, right? Psychologically, like human beings, we're different. Like and that's why I think probably having a real piece of, synthesizer hardware from the 70s, and you make music with that, it just has a different vibe, because the interaction is different, you
Yeah.
know. And I think that's really what it's about. And that's why I still like guitar pedals, for example, right? Like, that's why I'm still reamping through guitar pedals, because I can just, as the signal runs through, first of all, I have this magical thinking that, the signal goes through the cable and changes, right? And then it goes through the pedal, and I can actually tweak as I record, and that it's sort of like an add-on performance on whatever recording is already there. Like you said, like you have your initial recording, and then you mangle it, right? And but Barry, let me just jump back now. So talking about this, like the 80s and what you just did, and um, so how and when did, like, your interest in Joe Meek actually? I mean, how did that happen at all?
um, it's okay. So, excuse me. I was working at Mix Magazine, um, and I'd only been there a little while. I hadn't actually written much of anything. Or maybe no. At that point, I was working for Electronic Musician. They were the same, even the same building, same group of.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I had written a cover story on digital mixers for Electronic Musician, and the editor of Mix Books, or not editor, but the owner of Mix Books, basically publisher, Mike Lawson, came to me and he said, we're releasing 10 new books next year. Do you want to write one? And I said, what would I write it about? And he goes, well, we could do it on, I love that digital mixer thing. We could do the digital mixer book, because Mix Books were all educational recording books. That was the theme of them. And I said, yeah, but by the time you publish it, it'll be obsolete because this technology is moving so fast.
Yeah.
And somebody had loaned me a Joe Meek CD.
Hmm.
Um, and I hadn't even listened to it yet. It was just sitting on my desk. And as a joke, I mean, I thought he was kidding me. I mean, I was just getting started in writing and publishing. The idea that he would ask me to write a book just seemed ridiculous. So I pointed at that and I go, I could write about this guy. And he goes, well, what's that? And I said, oh, it's this innovative producer recording guy. And I didn't really know who he was, I was just making it up. And he goes, okay, we'll put together a proposal, for next week, we'll look at it. I thought he was kidding, but I did do a little research into Joe Meek, and I realized that some of the people that he had worked with were still alive, and that maybe I could, interview some people about him and find out what was going on. And so a week later, Mike comes back and he says, okay, where's your proposal? I got to turn it in this afternoon. I said, are you kidding? I mean, this was real, And he goes, yeah, well, so what do you got? And I said, well, I did find some people that I could interview. He goes like, okay, here's what we'll do. So the book's going to be about, working outside of the box, innovative things like Barry's bright ideas on working outside the box. And we'll use Joe Meek's stories as anecdotes. And he goes, now for your chapter titles, just put down the names of the people you think you'll be interviewing. So that was the proposal. And I found it just like a few months ago. It's funny. I was in some papers. And then the next day it comes back with the contract. So I sign the contract and they give me the money. And then I got home and it's like all of a sudden the light bulb went on. Like, I love the idea of writing a book, but I got to write a book. Like, what is that? I don't know how to do that. So anyway, I started researching Joe Meek, and it wasn't long. I contacted a guy who'd written a book on him, and then there was a guy at the British Museum Sound Archives and some other people that I talked to that sent me a bunch of material. And after about a month, it became really obvious to me that this guy was not a obscure footnote in the history of British recording. He was one of the most important figures in the history of recording, period. Mm-hmm. And I said to the publisher, look, man, this is ditch my, Barry's bright ideas. This is the story for this guy. Mm-hmm. And then I spent a year researching him, and I was fortunate. There's some pretty passionate people involved in that world, in the Joe Meek world. One of them gave me a spreadsheet with more than 1,000 recordings listed. And he said, I'll fill up 10 CDs full of recordings for you. You just tell me the ones you want. Mm-hmm. I still have that whole collection. Mm-hmm. And then John Repsch, who wrote the book on Joe Meek, it's not technical at all. He wrote about him just as a human being. John had gathered up a whole lot of material that didn't make it into the book because it was too technical. So he had interviews with engineers from Abbey Road and EMI, various studios, just gold nuggets. And he sent me a shoebox with all these cassettes in. And that stuff was incredible. And then I talked to Les Paul and Richie Blackmore and some other people. Blackmore was funny because people said he's impossible to deal with in an interview, and he'll never talk about Joe Meek. And he took my call, and all we talked about was Joe Meek for half an hour. He was a lovely man. So, but as we were going along with this thing, more and more information would come in. And basically for me, it was just connecting the dots. Like, there was all this information that was out there, disparate information, but nobody had really pulled it together, and created a coherent picture of this guy. And there were a lot of misnomers, like people saw him as a DIY guy, because he had a studio in his home in the 60s. But his career began in high-level professional studios in England in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And he was engineering hit recordings for major artists and doing all kinds of revolutionary stuff within the context of the industry. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't just some nut, in his bedroom. And he also, like I was talking about before, he invented all kinds of things. Anyway, right down to the time that we published the book, new information was coming in, and I kept having to rewrite whole sections of it because it would just throw new light on what was going on. For example, there's a list of the gear that was sold at auction when he died. And it's a very extensive, line by line, every little thing that he had. So that's a snapshot of one particular period of his gear. And his gear is constantly changing over the years, like with anybody, but he was particularly that way. And then also he modified gear because he was an electronics guy. So the stories are, when you go to his studio, all of his compressors and everything, that the panels were open on him. He's in there like dicking around with it constantly. Wires running across the room. He didn't really solder much of anything. He's twisting up the ends, and the guy's crazy. And then he's got nails in the wall where he has created tape loops, edited together loops, and he's just hanging them on the wall. There's no reference system. He knows what they are. He's doing stuff that's just like way beyond anybody else. But towards the end, one of the things that had been on that list was called the third man guitar synthesizer. And this is from 1967.
Mhm.
And I just thought that this was some sort of a mistake, or we could never find any evidence of this thing at all. And then right towards the end, some guy sends me a photograph from Watkins, and Charlie Watkins of Wem and Joe had collaborated on this guitar synthesizer, and it looks totally futuristic, kind of like the Roland, from the 80s. It's like cool little points on it. It's on a stand, and then it's got a separate module, almost like the Synthi Hi-Fi or something. And it's got the controls look like organ controls, like stop controls and things.
Mhm. Mhm.
It looks great. And I thought, okay, this thing is real. Wow, how come we never heard it?
Wow.
And then I talked to somebody who was there. I forget who it was, one of the guys that I interviewed. And he said, yeah, it looked really cool. The reason that you never heard it is because basically all the sounds were sort of different versions of flatulence. Now that's in the book, and there's a picture and everything. And so
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
just stuff like that happening constantly.
But
So I,
it's the idea that counts, right? And like it's good to fail, and then maybe some other people pick up the idea. And in the late 70s, we had the guitar synthesizer. So
right,
just you know,
right. Right. Nobody could remember how it worked or anything, like how they were doing the pitch to voltage or any of that stuff. It just,
yeah.
but it really looks cool in the photo. I mean, you can see.
Have you
Anyway,
have you have you experimented with converting your guitar signal to MIDI?
that's funny you would ask that. I have, but there's a recent, this is a weird story, maybe too weird for your podcast, but you can stop me if you think.
Nothing's too weird.
Okay. So I have this thing. It's too bad I put it away or I hold it up to the camera now. It's called a Vocalizer 1000, and it
Mhm.
was intended as a child's toy in the early 80s. It was done by the guys that went on to found Ensoniq.
Mhm.
So it was a $99 toy, but made by these genius guys who knew what they were doing. And the idea is you blow into it or hum into it or sing into it, and it translates that into MIDI. And then it has built-in like banks of sounds, and you could get little cartridges, and but it has like drum machines and all kinds of stuff built into it. It's a little plastic thing about this big, but it's got a MIDI output, and it also has a 1/4-inch jack.
Mhm.
So I plug a guitar into it, and it'll play all the sounds in there sort of. And then particularly if you put like a compressor and a fuzz on it and turn it way up so that the signal's really consistent,
Mhm.
and then turn the guitar volume out so all you're hearing is the synth parts, it works really well. And that's all over my Memory and Imagination record, so you can hear it. But then it'll actually track in, go out MIDI. So it's not, the string being converted to a MIDI signal. It's the actual audio that's converting MIDI. So there's no latency. It's zero latency,
Ah.
except for the tiny little bit of latency between the unit, into the computer and the processor.
Mhm. Mhm.
So one of the things that I was doing with it is trying to um, use it to control things like I have the Vienna Symphonic cellos, or different instruments,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I had minimal success with that, a little bit of success with it, but not a lot. For a while, I had the Moog guitar,
Mhm.
which is this amazing thing, and it's not a synthesizer. It has these proprietary pickups that uh, cause infinite sustain, or you can reverse the polarity and it sucks the sustain out, so you get
Yeah.
like a kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe instead of the fuzz and the compression, maybe if I run this thing into this
Mhm.
toy, the sound's going to be consistent enough that I can have a sustained note, with an instrument like a flute or a cello or something. So I hooked it up, and it kind of worked a little bit. And then I put the instrument down on the table, without turning the volume down. And it started generating random MIDI information. And if you turn the knob a little, it would change it, or if you tapped on it or hit the vibrato bar or whatever. And it's generating this MIDI information, and it was still hooked up to the cellos. And it's like playing these cello parts. So I recorded 3 of them and then mixed them together, right, left, center. I play this thing for people. Like I played it for, I'm making a record now with Kevin Castning. I don't know if you know Kevin.
Yeah.
He's a tremendous musician. He's a classical composer, is very astute. And I sent it to him. I go, what do you think of this? He thought it was an actual composition, that I'd somehow played this with a keyboard or something. It's mind blowing. There's also a similar thing happened when I was just using the guitar. At one point, I pulled the plug out and dropped it onto a wooden floor, and it started generating MIDI too. I can't remember which one came first. There's a piece on Stefan's record, the Outtakes record, called Beckoning Bells. That's this bell sounds, and then he's playing a Ebo solo over the top of it. That's the sound of the 1/4-inch jack hitting the wood floor, generating random MIDI parts. So I guess you could call that using guitar MIDI interface. And
that story wasn't weird at all. That's the kind of story we like, right?
And then there's stuff like the record I'd made with Richard Pinas a few years ago. There's a track on there that's, I think it's called Zen on Zen. That's got a lot of that guitar to the vocalizer 1000 and then out to a trumpet sound. And I'm trying to do like a phony John Hassel thing, got it running through a harmonizer, and not exactly his sound, but if you're familiar with his sound, you get the joke. So that's an example, but not much guitar with MIDI. It's just so feeble, and the tracking is so weird, and they're editing MIDI notes, and that's never been something.
It was never for me. It was just the sound was too far removed from the feeling of my finger on the string, really. And that's why processing the sound rather than going via converting it to a digital format, and then playing a synthesizer, you can kind of create a synthesizer sound just by processing the guitar string. And that means that you're still in contact with the source of, with the vibration of the string, and you can kind of modulate it with the fingers. And that's sort of what I enjoy. So MIDI was never an option for me.
Like what you do with the Helix, it's really organic sounding. It's very much, you hear all that articulation and all the things. There's no filter in between
and it's actually great that it's also great that it's not perfect. Like you can kind of like the overtone spectrum of the sounds, kind of like, if you don't hit the note hard enough, let's say, it gets more brittle on top. And I think all that kind of like contributes to the organic feel of no, the Helix has been amazing for me. I mean, we never spoke about it, but it really changed my life completely, and it's still sitting right here next to me, using it every day.
You'll pay me back for this by doing a blog post about that.
I would love to do that. Yes.
I do remember though, when I saw you playing, I guess it was Stickman at the little theater here that we were talking about, where I wasn't really paying any attention to what you were playing through. And the last time I think I had seen you play was with the Crimson Project, maybe. And at that time you had a bunch of pedals and a laptop and all kinds of stuff going on. And I guess it was either after the show or on a break or something, we were having a drink or something, and you said, I hear you're working with line 6. I'm using the Helix. And I said, wait a minute. All of that sound that I just heard coming off the stage, those amazing sounds, you got all that out of a Helix?
Yeah.
So that was kind of an eye opener for me.
Yeah.
And when I came to the office, I said, okay, you got to talk to this guy because he's not like trying to emulate Eric Clapton, like
Yeah.
the whole thing going on.
No, actually, before the Helix, it was the HD 500,
Mm,
which I also liked a lot. Like, there had lots of character.
mm,
Really, I mean, it's funny because I didn't really even wanted to talk about these things, but like there's like something about the Line 6 gear that it feels really, and I have to use this word, it feels really dirty,
mm.
and it feels great because it's just like it's not, it feels like it's, and I'm, maybe it's not a compliment, but it doesn't feel like it's pre-produced. It has some sort of like realness about it. I don't know why that is. It may be just the interface, the way that like I said, it's the way that you interact with the instrument or with the gear that plays a big role in how we psychologically process the relationship, right, with what we're using. And to me, it's always important that what I use is not perfect. It needs to allow for mistakes, which then you could say make what is the expression, which is the personal thing, right?
All the great analog pedals, the ones that are the classics, I mean, many of them, particularly like electroharmonics
Yeah.
pedals, they don't work. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's why they're great.
Yeah. 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 I mean, for a while I was looking, trying to find one of those synthesizer. What is it called? They have
Microsynth,
the microsynth. Yeah.
yeah,
And then I bought one that is kind of like a new one, like maybe from maybe 10 years ago, and it's still good, but it's not the same, right?
right.
It's not the same.
Well, I mean, so much of that old stuff, particularly electroharmonics, that from day to day they use different components. It was whatever the cheapest version of the resistor or the transistor. Whatever they're all different.
Yeah.
So if you get like, which is kind of funny with this whole pedal thing, and like I don't know if you know that I was involved in this pedal book that just came out,
Oh, I
Stompbox.
didn't know.
Oh, this is okay. So for all of the pedal and gear people watching this or hearing this,
Yeah.
um, it's called Stompbox 100 Pedals of the World's Greatest Guitarists, I think is the title they wound up with.
Mhm.
I started out as the editorial director of the book, working with a photographer in New York named Elon Paz. And I helped to, basically we came up with the concept for the book, which was going to be, he's taking these sort of museum quality, boutique um, photographs of a pedal, and then we would interview a guitar player. And the book's laid out so you have the beautiful photo on one side and you have the interview on the other side. And I did about 14 interviews or so. And then shortly after that, or at that point, is when I was offered the full-time job. So I couldn't keep it up, and it was passed on to some other folks. But it was recently published. It's the most amazing book. And then there's a companion volume that the editor, the guy who took it over, Dan Epstein, great editor, writer. It's just rare pedal rarities, and all it is, it's just amazing, amazing things that I imagined that I had a pretty encyclopedic knowledge of pedals. Mm. This stuff, most of them I'd never even heard of before, much less seen. I mean, this is such a extensive thing. Anyway, what I was getting around to is of course, these things all like a microsynth. I don't know what that goes for now, probably $1,000, for the original one. And a lot of these things, people are, they're fetish items. So they're buying stuff that I know. I remember what they sounded like when they came out. They sounded horrible. And now they're old, they think they're great and they pay all this money for them and stuff. And it's like some sort of magical thing. It's like, no, that pedal sounded like crap back then and it sounds bad now. But one of the things about it is if you take like 10 big muffs, say,
Mhm.
that are all from the same series, they're all from like 73 and through the year, and you open them up, they're all different.
Yeah.
They use whatever parts that were the cheapest that they could get, or Bill did it different than Sally or whatever, and they all sound different. It's amazing. And that's the charm of those things, that
Yeah.
you get one that doesn't, I've got a 73 Big Muff. It doesn't sound like any, others that I've heard. And
For me, it's the pedals, or just all, like more generally the gear that has a specific approach to how you control the sound that really makes the difference, right? It's not so much about the basic operation of it. It's how you could control it, or which parameters can be controlled with an LFO, for example. And there's one rare pedal, and I wonder if I've heard of that. It's the Peftronics Randomatic.
love it. I love
And it's super rare. And for some reason, Pat Mastelotto, he had one, or a friend of his had one, and we used it on one of the Tuner albums that we produced, and on the Tova Escapologist album, for those who are interested. It's really, really wonderful pedal that has the extremely unique sound, and but it's the design of it. It's not necessarily it's not the materials used. It's like how the idea of the inventor to give you some sort of extra control, like a random LFO on a short delay, for example, like what I think that's what the Randomatic did, right? And yeah, it's just fascinating. And but there you go. Like I have, I was always interested in learning to play my instrument better, and I had this vision of like, okay, maybe I'm not good enough, not good enough, but I actually do want to improve, right? But at the same time, I was also always interested in trying new sounds. And just yesterday, I was binging Central Zone, my band Central Zone recordings from '98, like really, for me, really old, right? And they had the lead sound was from a Boss GT5, but in the effects loop, I had a Digitech Talker, if you remember those. And I think they are very rare too now. And that combination just of that really like early digital Boss with the Talker, that was just sounds amazing.
Right. When you find those things, it's just so, I don't know. I mean, there's very few things in life that are better than that. Like on the Hologrammatoon record, there's a tune called Warning.
Uh-huh.
It's this just like ridiculously loud, I think it's an 11. It came up with the riff in the middle of the night by accident. I got this great sound with these pedals, and I just laid something down to have a record of it before passing out. And then I played it back the next day, and it's like, oh, this is an 11. I'll just keep it. So, but the sound is the fuzz that I like the most, and we just emulated it. It was modeled. It's in the new Helix, but it's called the ICBM fuzz, and it's back in the early 70s. Some of the big muffs had ICs instead of transistors. This is an emulation of that, one of those fuzzes. To me, for my thing, it's just for me. This is the greatest fuzz I've ever heard. And I have I have the 73 Big Muff. I've got a Pete Cornish fuzz. I've heard literally hundreds of them because of my job, a guitar player, stuff. This thing is the thing. So I'm running that into something called a Prunes and Custard. It's made by Crowther Audio.
Yeah, I have one of those. Yeah.
And so that into a micropog or a mini, whatever it is, the one that's got gives you 2 octaves down, and then that into, I guess that was the sound. Eventually, I ran it into a Mogerfoger Murph to get like a step sequencer sound. But this is the thing on Hologrammatron is without the Murph. But it's when you put those 3 things together, the sound is like, it would give Tony Iommi pause. It's just like, whoa. And I remember when I got that sound, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's just the chance combination of these things. And I fell out of my chair laughing, for like, I couldn't stop for like 10 minutes. Like, that is the greatest sound, I've ever gotten. So it's on the record if anybody's interested in hearing that. So it's called Warning. There's also on YouTube, we did a video for that.
Hmm.
Michael Maisley, again, this guy, he calls himself, among other things, the artist in general. And he has a costume that's kind of looks a little like the what's that guy's name that he was in charge of Coop, something Coop. Anyway, he dressed up in kind of a military thing, like white suit, and um, it's pretty out there. But we did this video, and Mike on the piece, Mike is just improvising, talking over it. That's a whole another story how that happened to be. But it's kind of hard to listen to. But if you want to hear that sound, that's where you could just put Warning. It's on YouTube and my name.
Okay, great, great, great. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, there, with guitar and with music production, that there's some people who are going after the stuff that sounds good. And usually the stuff that sounds good because you've heard it before, right? That's kind of like the psychologically what's happening. And I was pretty early on, I was aware of the fact that if I have the same pedals that everybody else uses, it's going to be, well, I can sound different with my fingers for sure, but if I want something else, I need to buy a line 6 pedal, and I buy an electro harmonics pedal, and I put it in the effects loop. And that way, by doing this, by combining different pieces of gear, you can kind of like create and find your own sound. And that still works nowadays. It still works. And there, because you have a multitude of combinations that people have not yet used. And so that's really, that's why when I start a new recording project, I always try to find a new combination. Like, for example, I recently I put the Boss GD5 in the effect cent on my Helix, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that I think is probably worth mentioning about the pedals is there is all this, obviously, this excitement about vintage pedals, and the prices are going way up, and people are collecting them, and there's all this rediscovery of these old pedals. But we live in the golden age of pedals. It's the
Mm-hmm.
pedals that are being made now that are so incredible. They're light years beyond anything that was ever done back in the 70s, let alone and the combinations, the potential to do what you're talking about, it's endless, it's infinite.
Yeah.
You could probably, some mathematician might take me to task on that and go, no, we can work it out to like 800 billion or something, but
No.
it's yeah. And then it's just the chance stuff, like I was describing, that one sound. It's like, I don't know, they're just, it's the same joy that a child gets discovering something for the first time.
Yeah.
You just,
Yeah. Yeah.
at least for
Yeah.
me, simple pleasure.
Yes, exactly. Okay, Barry, we've talked almost 2 hours, and let's wrap it up here. But I obviously encourage people to check out your work, music, writing, everything. And you have the Lodge, right, on your website, and that's a wonderful project. And yeah, and I hope I get to see you again in real life sometime. Like if we get to tour, we hardly ever tour on the West Coast. So, but yeah, I hope
Play
that's
in
gonna.
Hawaii, and I'll come see you there.
Yeah. Okay, Barry. Do you want to say anything else, or?
Only thanks so much for doing this. It was a lot of fun, and I hope, at least, I hope we haven't overstayed our welcome with your listeners.
No. It's yeah. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to reconnect with you, and yeah, see you again very soon.
All right.
Yeah,
Take good care.
yeah.
Stay
Bye
safe.
bye. Yeah, bye. So we can stay here,
Okay. Yeah.
and just a moment, because I just wanted to ask you something.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So I had a couple ideas for.